You've done a wonderful job for us of researching a little bit of the back history of Iran to put what is going on now in proper context. And I'm really stoked to hear some of this history. I knew some of it. There was stuff I totally didn't fucking know. Maximo does.
President Trump approved, then abruptly called off U.S. preparations for a military strike against Iran. The move came after the operation was already underway in its initial stages, with warships and planes already being put into position. The New York Times reports President Trump approved the strikes in retaliation for Iran shooting down an unmanned U.S. military surveillance drone with a surface-to-air missile, but then called off the attacks at the last minute last night. U.S. officials said targets would have included radars and missile batteries in Iran, and that strikes were scheduled for just before dawn this morning in order to minimize the risk to civilians and the Iranian military. It remains unclear if attacks on Iran might go ahead later. Iran says the U.S. drone it shot down was on a spy mission over Iranian airspace, but Washington says it was shot down over international airspace in the Strait of Hormuz. The Associated Press reports the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard's Aerospace Division says Iran had warned the drone several times before launching a missile at it. General Amir Ali Hajizadeh told Iranian state television on Friday, quote, "Unfortunately, they did not answer." Trump spoke to reporters about the downed drone Thursday in the Oval Office when he was meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters. Clearly, we have it all documented. It's documented scientifically, not just words. And they made a very bad mistake.
How will you respond, Mr. President? How will you respond?
You'll find out.
Are you willing to make a war with Iran?
You'll find out. You'll find out. I mean, obviously, you know, we're not going to be talking too much about it. You're going to find out. They made a very big mistake.
Amidst tensions over the downing of the U.S. drone, the Federal Aviation Administration has now barred American aircraft from flying over Iranian-administered airspace in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Other airlines have also changed the routing of their planes. All of this comes after Trump pulled the United States out of the 2015 nuclear pact with Iran last year and has imposed economic sanctions on Iran. On Tuesday, the U.S. announced it was sending 1,000 more troops to the region. In May, it also announced a 1,500 troop increase after attacks on 2 oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Iran has denied being involved in the attacks and has repeatedly said it's not seeking war with the United States. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other top Trump officials have reportedly been linking Iran to al-Qaeda and the Taliban during closed-door briefings with congressional lawmakers in what Democrats fear could be part of a plan to invoke the 2001 authorization for the use of military force to attack Iran.
Hey, we're back on Punks for Progress Weekly What the Fuck Report. I'm Reverend Aaron. I am joined by my comrade Maximo Moss from Texas. He runs our one of the people who runs our P4P Texas page, so go check that out on Facebook. But welcome, Maximo.
Hey, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here as always.
So, you saw what Amy Goodman had to say.
Yes, I did.
You got her take. But you're also, I'm going to give you a moment to comment on that if you have any thoughts as to her reporting on the issue. But you also are going to do you've done a wonderful job for us of researching a little bit of the back history of Iran to put what is going on now in proper context. And I'm really stoked to hear some of this history. I knew some of it. There was stuff I totally didn't fucking know. Maximo does. And, but did you have thoughts on Amy Goodman's take on the recent developments?
I mean, I'm not going to, really critique her too hard. The only things that I would mention is she did mention the reporting out of the New York Times, which happens to have unnamed official sources. I would kind of take that with a grain of salt. Another thing that she mentioned that I might question was the idea that Pompeo and Bolton are attempting to link Iran to Al Qaeda and ISIS. Maybe they are, but it's not necessarily needed in order to trigger the authorization of the use of military force from 2001, due to the fact that the U.S. government has already labeled Iran's Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization.
Right.
So they basically have a free shot at that anyway.
So, how the fuck did we get to this, man? I mean, this is not a manifestation of the Trump administration. Obviously, Trump is exacerbating things, and
yeah, I mean, the Trump administration is definitely making things worse. If you want, I can take you back to a little bit of the history, which actually goes back to World War II. So, like in 1941, you had what was known as the Soviet Anglo invasion of Iran, which took place in 1941. That actually ousted the then leader, Reza Pahlavi. Basically, they went in to capture Iran's oil resources under the guise that the Iranians were under Nazi influence. So that happens. Pahlavi is ousted. Fast forward to 1953. You had the coup, which ousted, it was a US-backed coup, well, US-UK-backed coup, because Mohammad Mossadegh was attempting to nationalize his resources, such as his oil resources. British Petroleum had a huge stake in the country. So what they did was they began a campaign to isolate Mossadegh, demonize him, attempt to link him with communism and the Soviet Union, providing a pretext for a regime change operation. So the first attempt did not go so well. The second attempt was successful, and that's what brought in Mohammad Pahlavi, which ends up being the son of the formerly ousted government that was ousted by the Brits and the Soviets back in 1941. So, you had a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953. It gets ousted. The Shah of Iran comes into power. One of the things that happened when the Shah came into power was the CIA provided the Shah with a list of dissidents so that they could effectively, and they did, exterminate all of the dissidents. We're talking labor leaders, union leaders, etc. Anybody that was against the Shah, more or less. Very brutal history there, and the Iranians, know it all too well. So that goes on until the revolution of 1979. 1979 happens, Khomeini's in power, and that's when the U.S. begins its sanctions regime towards Iran. In 1979, same year as the revolution, that's when they began sanctions. Their reasoning for the sanctions was because of the embassy being stormed by college students. So the response to that was sanctions. But sanctions plays a pretty consistent role in the history of U.S. and Iran relations.
Well, sure. And let me ask you real quick. So this is 1979. This is Carter administration, right? And this is when
Correct.
the Iran hostage crisis is happening. Correct? I mean,
Correct.
So put that.
Yeah.
Put that in context with the sanctions. Is the sort of Iran hostage thing, is that a response to the sanctions, or am I?
No, when the revolution occurred, that's when they stormed the embassy, took the hostages.
Okay.
Okay. A response to that was the sanctions.
Okay. Gotcha.
And then, of course, there was a failed attempt by the Carter administration to rescue the hostages. But kind of moving on, they had.
Well, let me say real quick. The sort of. The theory is basically that one, Carter had been publicly supportive of the Shah, and the Iranians were none too pleased about that, and there was the thoughts were that they were basically holding out. Ultimately they were going to let these hostages go, but they didn't want to give it to Carter. And so they sort of waited. I don't know if that can be proven. I don't think it can, but that's just kind of my understanding of that era. Is they just waited. Reagan was coming in, and
correct. That's actually known as the October surprise. The idea is that a lot of stuff actually points to. I mean, there's people that were there that saw. Some of Reagan's people in Paris during the talks before the hostages were released. Whether it's not been proven, but that's what they call the October surprise.
Gotcha. So,
but
yeah, I sidetracked you, and
no, you're good. You're good.
So, it's 1980 now? It's post this 79 revolution, the Iran hostage crisis.
Right. So, in 1980, though, first you had the Iraq invasion of Iran. This, of course, was U.S. backed. The U.S. eventually would kind of end up backing both sides. And it was, in fact, the U.S., France, and I believe it was Germany that provided the gas and the know-how for Saddam Hussein to gas the Kurds. So that happens. Eventually, then it's 1988, another major event. There's sanctions throughout this whole process. The next major event is basically the downing of an Iranian airliner, Flight 655, had 290 people on board. It was fired on by the USS, I want to call it the Vincennes, not sure how to pronounce that, which was a huge provocation, one in which the United States still to this day refuses to apologize for. So sanctions have continued all the way up to this point. What's happening today is a reflection on everything that has happened in the past leading up to this point. It's been a consistent policy of isolation. They attempt to isolate Iran, whether it's through economic warfare or covert ops, pretty much by any means necessary.
So it's a hell of a lot to, it's just I do feel like with Trump sort of undoing the quote-unquote Iran deal, it has derailed and sent things into a different direction than they were before. Do you feel like what Obama did with this Iran deal was it just, I'm not well versed on what it really was. I know it ended sanctions, all these sanctions that had been in place forever, right?
Yeah.
And there was a bunch of money that was tied up in, that was their money, but had been tied up as a part of these sanctions, so that gets released. There's this huge sort of surveillance regime that goes into place, right, to make sure that they're not enriching uranium. The bourgeois press says that they were in compliance with it.
They absolutely were. Yeah.
not that I don't have a beef either way. I'm not supportive of, nor do I have a beef with Iran. I mean, my beef is with this American imperialist government going out and doing things and acting like it's representative of me, because it fucking isn't, right? Like, but it just sounds like, and I'm just hesitant to believe anything that Obama said, because that dude was full of shit too, and the press would have fucking, spewed any, perspective that, the status quo line coming out of the White House at the time. It was either, right-wing blatant lies about things he never did or said, and their right-wing followers freaking out over these imaginary things he supposedly did. And then the left just getting the stories that Obama administration wanted the left to hear. Or I should say the liberal media. There's not really a leftist media. But so it's just like, the reason I really appreciate you doing this background homework, Maximo, for real, is that, like, I think a lot of people are struggling with, like, who the fuck do you believe? Like, you can go to the CNN or the MSNBC, but they're sold out to a bunch of fucking corporations that are going to lie to you to protect capitalism.
Well, one of the things that I think is lacking with the mainstream media is they refuse to put anything within any kind of historical context. But what I think is even more important is they completely forget about international law. And that should be the standard. At the very minimum, international law should be the standard. So if you look at the situation as it is today and who is actually in violation of international law, unfortunately, that dubious distinction would go to the West.
Right.
Iran hasn't actually attacked anybody in centuries.
Right.
So
literally centuries.
Yeah, literally, and that's still iffy. So this idea that they would place mines on a tanker that's owned by the Japanese at the exact same time the Japanese Prime Minister Abe is meeting with the Iranians is ludicrous. But both incidents have been debunked in a sense. The U.S. State Department's narrative completely fell apart. The operators on on two of the tankers said that they saw something coming from the air.
Right, airborne projectile, as opposed to something attached to the hull.
Right.
Which is what the Trump administration in that grainy video that you can't see shit that's going on is supposed to be this, incontrovertible fucking proof. It's nonsense.
Right, and what they don't mention is when that happened, the Iranians actually went in, the Iranian Navy went in to rescue sailors. I believe they rescued something like 44 sailors. So that video could actually be real, and it could actually be the Iranians trying to get sailors out. Who knows? But the video isn't compelling at all. There's no way to tell if that's the tanker or if that's an Iranian boat. There's just no way to tell. And
Well, I would tell you, like, that would make absolute sense to me, because that is how fascism works. It's like, it's conceivable to me that was like a humanitarian effort going on in that boat to help people who had been, I don't know, might be suffering or have been hurt in this attack somehow. And then this fascist fucking Trump administration comes along and goes, oh no, this is people trying to kill people. Humanitarian efforts being labeled as, terrorist murder efforts. It's just typical. I mean, there's no way to prove that that's the truth, obviously, but, like, that seems more par for the course for me. You know what I mean? And, like, and then I'll tell you, I know you have some theories as to what this Trump supposedly, starting the fucking, giving the go-ahead to attack and then pulling back at the last minute. I'll give you a moment to give your thoughts, but it just seems to me, man, like he's such a child, like, intellectually, and, I'm not trying to be mean, like, he's not informed at all. He's never had an intellectual curiosity throughout his entire life. and probably wasn't born with all that much smarts to begin with, but then just lumps onto it a whole lot of no brain power or, no taxing his brain ability throughout his life. So he's just a fucking idiot. Like the guy in the fucking fire engine. I think he thought, and again, no way to prove this, but I think he thought, I wonder if I can do it. Let's see. Like he wanted to try out the big toy, And then when he saw he could do it, he's like, oh shit. And okay, stop. Now I know I can do it. Now, whether that's true or not, it doesn't matter. It's just kind of a fun anecdotal fucking sort of perception. But what I gather from it, man, is there was no Senate approval to even begin that launch of violent, unprovocated military action against another country. According to the U.S. Constitution, the Senate has to give approval for that. Now, I'm not trying to be like, oh man, let's restore our democracy. I mean, like, I got issues with the framing of the Constitution in and of itself, which we don't need to get into. But it didn't hold up. That's one of my main issues with it. It didn't hold up. Like, the Senate's supposed to be the only one that gives the approval to do something like that. And whether, Trump followed through with it or pulled it back or not, it began. He gave the fucking go-ahead to the military to start war against another country. Sure, he pulled it back, supposedly, or whatever. But that's a sidelining of Congress that shows me that the checks and balances in the Constitution don't hold up, man. It's not this glorious, perfect fucking document. But again, that's kind of maybe another total side tangent. But I know you had thoughts on the whole started war, didn't start war thing. So,
well, as far as the big pullout goes, I don't really actually believe it necessarily. Mostly because the information came from the New York Times, from unofficial sources. Right. So we don't have any official sources. I don't remember if it was in a tweet or how it was made public, but Trump had mentioned, or the Trump administration had mentioned, that they actually sent Iran a warning that they were going to attack. The Iranians, of course, deny this. I don't know why you would send a warning, but whatever. I really think that they weren't going to attack. I really think that this is kind of a power play to try to get the Iranians to the negotiating table, similar to what they did with North Korea. I don't think it worked. Plus, it's more likely that the United States violated Iranian airspace. And from what I understand, there was actually 2 planes in the air, unmanned drone, as well as another military aircraft with, I believe, 36 people on board. The Iranians elected not to shoot that one down. But they did get the drone after several warnings. But I don't see it. What I'm curious about is, what is their next move now that they've come out and tried to tell the world that they were going to start a war, but they themselves now have averted the war. Where do they go from here? Because nothing has changed from the Iranian side. The only thing that I see is, I guess, the last thing that I saw was Donald Trump is going to be imposing additional sanctions, right, on Iran on Monday. And my question kind of is, if you've been doing this since 1979, you've been imposing sanctions on Iran since 1979. How much more can you do to crush their economy and kill as many of their people as possible? Which is what they're trying to do. They did the same thing in Iraq. I mean,
well, so my thoughts, and we'll start to wrap this up. I don't think we're going to solve the Iranian crisis in this episode of the What the Fuck Report. We might get close.
No, it's hard to predict. I mean, this is a lot of conjecture and commentary. We don't, it's Donald Trump for fuck's sake.
Right.
It's very difficult to know, what he's talking about, or if even he knows what he's talking about.
No, absolutely. And I was going to say, I think some of the progressive takes might be kind of accurate, like the TYT Majority Report, Michael Brooks sort of perspective, is that the inner battles within his own administration. I mean, there are differing perceptions. There's people within his administration who see the futility and the literal insanity of starting military conflict with Iran. And then others, I mean, he's got Pompeo and Bolton in there who are bleeding out their ass in anticipation of being able to fucking bomb Iran, and Trump is a sociopath, I think, who has absolutely no empathy for other human beings and doesn't give a shit either way. I don't think he has a big, giant fucking, kink to go to war with Iran. I think he'd rather have Twitter battles.
Yeah.
And, so it does, apply to what you're saying is he's so unpredictable because he's so stupid. So who knows? But there is that. So he has within his administration these nefarious fucking scumbags who have all differing perspectives on what to do about Iran, all trying to influence this fucking moron.
Yeah. And then now you have Mark Esper, the former CEO of, or former executive rather, of Raytheon, coming in. So.
Oh, he's he's the one that's going to stand to,
I would think
generate the funds,
yeah.
He would love the idea. But yeah, we'll see what happens. You mentioned October surprise. All this could be great, baby steps towards an actual, October surprise is now synonymous with, the election cycle. Like in October, the candidate does something or brings out the secret dirt on the, their opposing candidate or whatever. And a lot of times it's war becomes the October surprise. And,
Right.
You and I and real leftists, we see the nonsense. We instantly see through it. It's a thin veneer of bullshit. They're not even trying. It's so obvious this is all such garbage. And but the people who, get all their information from their AM radio and maybe a 30-minute nightly news episode or millions of people, all you'd have to say is, well, remember with the tankers, the Japanese tankers that Iran shot? And people go, yeah, I remember that, last year. Remember? And they, that's all it takes, man. And if you can get a picture of a dead American.
Oh, jeez, yeah.
So it's, I don't want to sound, doom and gloom, the sky is falling. I mean, I'll be honest, I got really freaked out when he first started going at North Korea. A couple years back, it really made me, that was the first time I think really in my life I questioned, realized the reality of nuclear war.
Oh, yeah.
And
Did you see the recent Pentagon report that came out that said basically, more or less, the Pentagon still believes nuclear war is winnable?
Oh my God.
Yeah. That's really, really scary. The Russians seem to think that the U.S. is moving towards more tactical nuclear weapons, a lower yield, so they'll be, in a sense, easier to use, than an ICBM, I guess.
Well, Jesus Christ.
But, the North Korea thing isn't over. The Iran thing isn't over.
Venezuela.
Brazil. I don't think they're done with Syria either.
No.
So
Yemen.
Yeah. Goes on and on, doesn't it?
It does. But, at least we get to end on a positive note, which is apparently nuclear war is winnable. I think we should play some punk rock. Get the fuck out, come back, do some more segments in a minute. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about MAGA terrorism. And we will get to the issue of all these fucking abortion laws across the country. But hey, Maximo Moss, thanks so much for fucking hanging with me, getting our followers a little up to speed on the history of Iran, providing some fucking context for us. Appreciate
Excellent.
it.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it, comrade.
Cool, man. We'll be right back.